Hey everyone, it's Ed Gutowski. What I wanted to do was to create a video that talks about two things that we're going to talk about for this week. And one, we're going to talk about logical fallacies, and the second thing we're going to talk about is MLA. Now, hey, I have pretty much recovered from my heart surgery. You notice I've grown out this cool beard. Since then, I don't know if I'm going to keep it. If you want to let me know in a discussion board if I should keep my beard. Maybe I'll let you class decide whether or not I should keep my beard or shave. But either which way, there are two things that I wanted to focus on for this week. And one of them, you'll notice we're going to do a review on MLA. And MLA, it's important that we review MLA, and the English department requires that we kind of go over and review the rules of MLA. And, what I tried to do was create kind of a tongue-in-cheek way to make MLA fun. I may have failed miserably, but basically what you're going to do, there's a couple modules you'll kind of review that talk about MLA, how to works cite a book source, and then you're going to kind of works cite two books. One of them is a total fake imaginary book I made up. Just sort of have fun with that because I throw in a bunch of unnecessary information. I want to see if you can works cite a book based on me giving you some information, and then another is, I believe, you're works citing Into the Wild, and then it's how to do proper in-text citations. Just have fun with it. Read over the modules, have fun with it, but just be careful that I do take a point off each MLA error, so it's important that you pay attention to some details. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about more for a specific lecture is I wanted to talk about the next step in rhetoric and argument. And the discussion board questions have been fabulous. I've loved everyone's definition of rhetoric and argument. We now know rhetoric and argument use three things. It uses logos, pathos, ethos, which is logic, emotion, and character authority. So now I'm going to talk about how rhetoric and argument separates itself, because there's one thing that rhetoric always uses that a good argument always avoids, and that is fallacies. So I wanted to talk about fallacies, and I sometimes think what happens when we talk about fallacies is kind of students panic, or they get nervous, right? They hear the term fallacy, they get bored, or they hear the term fallacy and they think fallacies are hard. But fallacies, once you kind of recognize how they work, some of them really interesting, some of them are pretty silly, and some of them are just downright stupid. But I think there's a merit to being able to identify fallacies. So in a ground class, what I would do is I would write the word fallacy on the board, and I'd ask students to define what they think the term fallacy means. And notice, if you just hear the term fallacy, most of what comes to mind, students can say, is something that is false. So fallacies generally are defined as something that is false, something that is fake, and I define fallacies as false logic. So if you think about it for a second and you accept my definition of rhetoric, which has not changed as of week 3, but if you accept my definition of rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, deceive, and con people, then if you're out there in the real world and you come across someone that is using rhetoric and they're using a fallacy, right, something that's false, something that's fake, false logic, what happens is you start to critically think, and rhetoric has less of an impact on you. So I think it's important that you, to be able to recognize certain fallacies. So in chapter 5 of our textbook here, there are a list of fallacies, and what I want you to do is kind of look over some of the fallacies. And so I'll tell you a couple of some of the fallacies that I always really like. I like the fallacy, the ad hominem. And what the ad hominem is when you attack a person's character rather than addressing an issue. So you attack a person's character rather than addressing the issue. So imagine you have an imaginary student who says, "Don't take Professor Gutowski's class. He's just like Hitler. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class. He's just like Saddam Hussein. Don't take Professor Gutowski's. He's a real son of a bitch." Well, notice what that student did was use an ad hominem. He attacked my character rather than addressing the issue. Notice he didn't say, "Don't take Professor Gutowski's class because his Canvas site is confusing. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class because his lectures don't make sense. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class because when he reviews MLA, it's confusing. So an ad hominem is when you attack a person's character rather than addressing an issue. The other fallacy I like is the non sequitur. And the non sequitur is essentially when you take two things that have nothing in common and you try to associate them together. Two things that have nothing in common and try to associate them together. So, that same student might say, hey, don't take Professor Gutowski's class. It's just like being at Auschwitz. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class. It's just like being at Dachau. Don't take Professor Gutowski's class. It's like being in a concentration camp. And notice that is a complete non sequitur, right? Because it's associating two things that have nothing in common, my class and a concentration camp. And the reason I kind of like these two fallacies is notice that we see them all the time. We see them used in politics quite often. And sometimes they can be frustrating, sometimes they can be silly, and sometimes you wonder why people say such things, right? They're failing to critically think. The other fallacy that I always like is the bandwagon. It's so easy. Everyone else is doing it. Why aren't you? Right? The bandwagon is one of those fallacies that's easy for students to identify. So there's a discussion board question where you'll be asked to look over the fallacies in Chapter 5 of our textbook. I think there's something like 16 fallacies. And I want you to pick the fallacy you like the best and pick the fallacy you like the worst. And I'll look forward to what you're having to say. I know there's a lot of work in week 3. I tried to spread it out. But that is our agenda.